The Nintendo Entertainment System was my first video game console and is home to some of my fondest gaming memories. This console has spawned countless timeless classics, and thanks to the miracle of emulation, I'm still finding great titles more than 30 years after their release. Let's dive in. This is Risky Business. Today we're taking a deep dive into the Famicom, also known as the NES or the Nintendo Entertainment System. I am really excited about this one. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been curious to find out how things work. In this deep dive, we're going to take a look at the technology inside that big gray box and its little red and white cousin, and find out how those bits and bytes do their magic. If you like these educational videos, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. I'll be deep diving into a different piece of hardware every month. What do you think about these deep dives? Let me know in the comments. Also leave a comment if you have any corrections or anything to add. The NES now has a long history of dedicated developers building emulators and homebrew games, so information about the system is plentiful online. I'll link some great sources in the video description. I'll be using the terms Famicom and NES interchangeably throughout this video. The NES's success is attributed to Nintendo's business model of licensing third-party developers. This agreement also meant third-party developers could only use official cartridge shells purchased through Nintendo, at whatever price Nintendo asked. It was for this reason that Nintendo was able to thrive after the video game crash. Prior to Nintendo, other console makers like Atari had no control over third-party games. Nintendo got paid every time a game for their console was sold. In addition to this, Nintendo had strict control over who could make games for their system. While authorized games were made throughout the life of the NES, legal battles ensued and Nintendo won those lawsuits. It just wasn't worthwhile to try and beat Nintendo. The Famicom has an eject button that is not necessary. Cartridges can safely be removed from the unit without it, but it was included because Gunpei Yokoi thought that children would enjoy pressing it. Worldwide, Nintendo has sold over 61 million Famicom and NES systems. That is a whole lot of toasters. Here's where it gets really deep, so put on your scuba gear and watch out for sharks. If you aren't too interested in the technical details, skip to the end and we'll talk about some of the greatest games on the platform. The Famicom was powered with the Ricoh 2A03, 8-bit processor running a MOS technology 6502 core. In PAL regions, the RP2A07 was used, but these are virtually identical. This processor was manufactured exclusively for the Famicom. The 6502 core was modified to disable binary-coded decimal mode, which converts sets of 4 bits into a specific decimal number. I wasn't able to find out much about why this mode was disabled, except that the technology may have been copyrighted. This actually reduced the processing power of the unit, so there must have been a very good reason. This processor was developed in 1975, which shows just how good Nintendo really was at using old tech. This is a 1.79 MHz processor, so to put this in perspective, the current Nintendo console, the Switch, runs a 1 GHz processor, which is about 600 times faster than what the NES had. It's amazing how far technology has come in the past 30 years. If we want to really be very surprised, if you look at a personal computer like I have that was built for gaming, I have a processor that is even faster than that. The processor chip used 22 memory-mapped I/O registers to control the sound, memory mapping, and game controller polling. APU, or Audio Processing Unit, is the name given to the sound chip. This is housed inside the 2A03, and the sound chip is capable of generating sound on 5 channels, 2 pulse wave channels, 1 triangle wave channel, 1 noise channel, and 1 sample channel. A lot of the sound we hear in NES games are a combination of different tricks that are used to make a lot of sound with a very limited chip. Nintendo were experts at making this kind of old tech seem new. A pulse wave generates that long beep sound that we often associate with gaming from this generation, and the modulation of the time of the pulse is what determines the pitch of the beep. Each pulse wave channel can use 4 different voices or types of sound, and can switch them during the wave, making a large number of different sounds possible. Both wave channels do the same thing, but having 2 channels just means you can have 2 instruments at a time. This is where most of the melodies you hear in Nintendo games come from. It's amazing what you can do with a beep. The triangle wave is a much more complex wave and can generate sound frequencies up to 55.8 kHz. A lot of the bass sounds we hear in NES games are generated by a triangle wave. It's the bassier beep that we hear in a lot of games, which can be played with to make many kinds of different bass sounds. The noise channel is what is used to create most of the drum sounds you hear in Nintendo games. Slaps, scratches, and metallic sounds all come from the noise channel. The sample channel is used for different purposes. It can be used to create 1-bit samples of external audio and allows the Famicom to play sounds outside the range of its other channels, so it's really a very primitive sampler. The audio is tied to a frame counter to make sure the correct sounds come out at the correct time while the game is being played. Memory mapping, or DMA, direct memory access, allows the hardware to access main system memory independently of the processor. This allows the CPU of the Famicom to offload tasks to other system components. Because the CPU is very slow, the Famicom has to allow the PPU to directly access system RAM in order to generate graphics data on screen faster. This made it able to display sprites 4 times faster than it would without DMA. Imagine how slow those games would have been. While the Famicom had an 8-bit CPU, it was still capable of using a 16-bit address space, so it could reference up to 64 kilobytes of memory. The Famicom hardware itself only had 2 kilobytes of RAM. While some of the addressing space was used for background processes like controller mapping and sound, game cartridges also had memory chips, and this is where the game data was located. Unlike modern media today, where all the game data is in storage, cartridges all had game data right there on hard memory chips. I've talked before about how game cartridges are basically expansion slot cards that connect directly into an expansion slot on the board, and that's exactly what NES cartridges did. Many cartridges, especially later in the life of the NES, used memory mappers to make games much larger than 64 kilobytes. They could swap characters and program memory in and out of the addressable memory space quickly. The largest cartridge in the Famicom library is Metal Slater Glory, which has 1 megabyte of data in its memory. NES cartridges contain 2 types of memory, both on ROM or read-only memory chips. One contained character data, and the other contained program data. And character data is a fancy way of saying what you see on the screen. Program data is a fancy way of saying what those things on the screen are doing. And when we talk about the memory on a cartridge, in many cases the cartridge didn't actually have that much memory on it, but because of the memory mapping capabilities of the system, it was able to swap out that memory and use it more than once for different data. The Famicom's picture processing unit, or PPU, was 3 times faster than the CPU and capable of displaying a background layer and up to 64 sprites, which is really impressive for the time. It could also scroll 1 pixel at a time, which was a really big deal. Home computers at the time could not do this, which is why early home computers didn't really have platforming action games. They couldn't scroll, so you wouldn't be able to do a game like Super Mario Bros. Where scrolling is how you move across the level, and the background of course moves the opposite direction. The PPU used 256 bytes of memory which stored the sprites, and it supported 54 distinct colors, which doesn't sound like a lot right now. It's a relatively crude color palette to what we're familiar with, but if you think about it, this was a time when most home video games could only support a handful of colors. There were some key differences though between the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System we saw in the West. The controllers for the Famicom were hardwired to the back of the console, whereas the US pads used a 7-pin connector to allow for third-party controllers to be used. The Famicom's second controller included a microphone, but this was used in very few games. The Famicom supported a number of exclusive peripherals, including a keyboard used with the basic cartridge, and the Famicom Disk System, which I've done another video on, and you can click on the card on the screen to see that. There was even a modem available for the Famicom, but it didn't allow online gameplay. Instead, it was a portal to a proprietary network that provided various business and financial services. There was even a 3D headset for the Famicom, if you can believe that. Some peripherals available for both systems include Rob the Robot, the Power Pad, and the Zapper Gun. There used to be controller ports on the US version, but in Japan, they connected to a special expansion port on the front of the unit. The now famous front-loader design of the US NES was made to mimic the appearance of a VCR. This was to distance the NES from other video game systems, since the entire industry had all but failed by this point. This caused a number of issues, including the flashing blue and black screen that many of us remember from our childhood. Pushing the cartridge down to lock it in place caused wear on both the cartridge pins and the system pins. Today, many retro enthusiasts mod their NES consoles, so it is no longer necessary to push the cartridge down, thus extending the life of the system and cartridges. The cartridges in Japan used a proprietary 60-pin connector, and their US and Europe counterparts used a 72-pin connector. While the Japanese Famicom did not have lockout, cartridges were not compatible across regions due to the difference in size and number of pins. Like the console itself, Famicom cartridges are much smaller than their US counterparts. Congratulations on making it through the hardware portion of this deep dive. If you enjoyed that, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications for more. If you didn't really like the technical stuff, we're going to talk now a little bit more about the games. I'm going to have plenty of videos just about games if you're not too into the deeply technical portion of the video. Along with complex audio, arcade-style gameplay, and some of the most advanced graphics for a home video system of its time, NES games were often known for their very high level of difficulty. I can only speculate, but most gamers agree that the purpose of the high level of challenge was to provide value for the consumer. Many games on the system, especially earlier titles, could be finished in an afternoon, and offered little more to do once the game has been completed. However, a very challenging game would take many attempts to win, meaning the player would feel that the game was worth purchasing rather than renting or borrowing from a friend. Many arcade games were ported to the NES, and were usually a far cry from their coin-op counterparts in terms of graphics and sound. This was often made up for by adding more depth to the game. Titles like Strider, Rygar, and Bionic Commando may not look as good as they do in those stand-up machines, but they often contain more adventure and RPG elements that make the NES version unique. The NES has an incredibly diverse library of games. Everything from action platformers, shooters, role-playing games, sports, light gun, and a game where you use a robot as a controller, and even dating sims. It's impossible to narrow down just a few games that really exemplify the NES. So rather than select a few games and discuss them at length, I would like to hear what NES games you would like to know more about. Leave a comment, and I'll make some videos on the games that people comment about the most.
There are a few things I forgot to mention, so I've added them here at the end of the video. One really interesting thing is that the Nintendo Entertainment System was the first system to support battery-backed saves. And this was done by putting a piece of SVRAM in the cartridge along with a backup battery. SVRAM is volatile storage, which means that as soon as the system is turned off, the data is erased. By adding a battery, it made that never actually turn off, and thus it was not erased until the battery died. And those batteries can be replaced if you have an old cartridge. It's just a regular watch battery. The other storage on the cartridges is non-writable read-only memory. Another interesting thing about some cartridges is that in Japan, some of the Famicom cartridges actually had additional sound chips on them. Konami had its own sound chip, and so did Namco. So there are some games like Castlevania 3 in Japan, for example, or the Shin Megami Tensei series in Japan that had additional sound channels because they had additional audio processing chips on the cartridge itself. So pretty neat, a lot of stuff you could do on the Famicom that you could not necessarily do with a disc-based system, for example.
I don't remember how old I was, or even what time of year it was, but all I remember is that one day my dad came home with a Nintendo. I was maybe 5 or 6 at the time. I had no idea what it was. I had never even played a video game before. My sister hooked it up to her little TV in her room, and we played Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt for the first time. I remember from there we played Wizards and Warriors, we played Deadly Towers, eventually Zelda, which my sister told me was the never-ending game, which at the time seemed impossible, and really it was, and now today we really do have games that never end, so it's really pretty amazing. But that was the beginning for me of a lifelong love of video games, and I remember being a kid, there were so many games that I really loved to play, even Ghostbusters, Kung Fu, playing Karate Kid at my friend Mark's house, Jaws, even like the bad games, LJN the games and all that, playing Friday the 13th, just so many fun, wonderful games and great experiences I had with that system growing up as a kid. And I think unless you grew up at that time, you really can't understand just how massive Nintendo was for us as kids. It was such a huge part of our culture. It was in our Saturday morning cartoons, there was a breakfast cereal, we had bed sheets, I had sweatpants with a Nintendo logo on them as a kid. It was all over the place in our popular culture, and it was so massive. Really at a time when the video game industry had all but died. Nintendo breathed new life into that industry just by doing smart business. They did a lot of things that other game companies didn't do. They licensed their games, they made their third parties pay them for the privilege of selling those games. And they merchandised absolutely everything as much as they could. They did a really fantastic job. And today Nintendo's still going strong. They've had their bumps in the road, they've had their ups and downs, they've made bad decisions, they've made great decisions. But for over 30 years, Nintendo has been doing amazing business in the video game world, and it all started back then. And I'm never going to forget, when I was growing up, how big an impact Nintendo had on my life. If you love the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Famicom, be sure to like this video, subscribe, leave a comment, turn on notifications, and yeah, tell me all about your favorite Nintendo games. In the comments, let me know, what Nintendo games do you love the most, and what would you like to see me do a video on? Until next time, game over.